Hello, I am Joshua Burke, Associate Professor of History at Smith College, and I'm here today to present the Society for Italian Historical Studies Article Prize for Medieval and Early Modern History. I'm going to sort of introduce the prize winner, talk about the article, and just so everyone knows, I'll read the whole citation of the text, and then we'll get into a discussion of your work. I want to introduce everyone to Matteo Pompermaier, who's a research fellow at the University of Brescia, who works in the Department of Economics and Management. Matteo holds a PhD in early modern history from the University of Padua and the University of Rouen-Normandy. Your expertise lies in financial history, particularly looking at credit markets that exist sort of before banking dominates that sphere. You look at the structure and functioning of those markets. And I think what's extraordinary about your work is that you sort of give us a view of how that those worlds of credit work for people at sort of the bottom of the socioeconomic strata. You work also on the role of women as borrowers and lenders, and sort of this female economic agency in this period. And your current project, which I hope we can get into, is working on intergenerational wealth accumulation in Sweden between the 18th and the 20th century. And you've published numerous peer-reviewed journals, and you have a monograph out, which I think this article builds into, right, on credit and microcredit in 18th century Venice. So we'll definitely want to talk about that. So the prize, as I said, is the article prize for medieval and early modern history, which we are awarding to you for your article Credit and Poverty in Early Modern Venice, which appeared in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History in March of 2022. And the award committee, which consists of myself, Daniel Bornstein from Washington University in St. Louis, and Carrie Benet from New College in Florida, were sort of blown away by this article because of the way, well, I'll read the citation here. In this carefully reasoned and clearly written article, Pompermaier uses records of property auctioned by the Giustizia Nuova to recover the material world and honor the stories of people who do not usually appear in the documentary record. By examining the credit services of Venetian inns and wine shops, which provide microloans and sold wines on credit against the pawn of simple household objects or items of clothing, such as handkerchiefs, Pompermaier shows how the possession of these commonplace material goods gave the working poor of 18th century Venice access to credit. His genuinely interdisciplinary study will be of interest to cultural, economic, and political historians, as well as historians of medieval material culture. I just wanted to know first, like, what your reaction to the citation was. What did we get right? What did we miss in the significance of this article?
Well, first, I want to thank you for this conversation, and I also like to thank you, the Society for Italian Historical Studies, and the committee for the prize. I was very honored and very happy when I received the news. Well, I think you get it right in what you just said, in the sense that there's a citation. I think I mentioned that in the paper as well. It's quite famous by Michel Mola, who says that basically the poor are voiceless individuals in history. And I think in many cases that is true. It's true not because historians don't want to study them, of course, but just because it's very difficult to find sources about that. And the first thing I have to say is that I was very lucky that I managed to find this marvelous documentation in this mine that is that are the state archives in Venice.
Yeah, can you tell us more about those source materials and what you found in the archives?
Yeah, so well, as you probably noticed in the paper, well, in this specific paper that is part of a bigger project, I mainly refer to one specific archive, which is the archive of the Giustizia Nuova, which is just mentioned. which translates in English as something like the novel justice. And it's just to distinguish it from a pre-existing magistracy that was the old justice, of course. So this magistracy had two specific tasks. The first one was to organize the structure that was built to host the foreigners in Venice. So Venice was a big city, was a big commercial hub, was a big port, and it was also a cultural and religious center. So every year, you can imagine a lot of foreigners went to the city, arrived in the city, and need to be accommodated somewhere. And so this magistracy took care of that, to like checking, controlling this system, which was very crowded, full of different activities, among which inns, of course, lodging houses, etc. So this was the first task of this magistracy. The second one was to control the wine market, which was somehow related to the hospitality sector, because let's say that the activities were more or less the same. We can think about the inns again, accommodated hosts and also sold wine. So those were two very important activities for Venice. And after, with my research, we discovered actually the Giustizia Nuova also controlled part of the credit market, and more specifically, the pawnbroking activity that innkeepers and bastioneri provided to their customers. So this is like the core where I found most of the sources for this paper. And well, within the archive of the Giustizia Nuova, where there's like a lot of different kind of sources, there's normative, let's say, documentations of where that basically were implemented to regulate this activity. Then there's wonderful trials also, which really allows us to go and look at specific cases like windows on the past trials. I really like working with trials. And then there's a lot of accounting, because they really wanted to be sure that everything was done in the right way, that there were no like frauds, thefts, etc. They wanted to protect the poor from the lower strata from this point of view. And so this is why I was lucky enough to collect more than 30,000 amounts of transactions that are in the charts you can see in the paper. So let's say this was the core of the sources with which I worked.
Yeah, I think I'd love to talk more about the inns and the bastioni, who are these warehouses, right? They're selling wines. We often think about in our society about like short-term lending and sort of the sort of communal lending as potentially being predatory. But you really talk about, as if I'm reading this right, the sort of value that this kind of peer-to-peer lending and peer-to-peer credit exchanges provided to sort of the bulk of the population of Venice. And I wondered if you could sort of talk more about sort of how you conceive of the role of the people who were sort of overseeing these pawnbroking operations. And yeah.
So, well, if we look at sources, there are different opinions of this activity as a whole, because, well, it went a little bit unnoticed. There's not literature on that, unfortunately. So if we read, there are some authors in the 19th century that wrote about that when the Monte di Pietà, the municipal pawn shop, was established in Venice. Very late, we are in the 1820s, so it's very, very late. But so when they celebrate the creation, the establishment of the Monte di Pietà, they were criticizing a lot all the forms of credit or lending that existed before, among which this one. The impression I got of this activity is that it was important because if we think about lower strata, and this is not something I discovered, this is something we know from other research, like Patricia Alston in Venice, Beverly Lemire, more in general, or in England, that the lower strata usually save by accumulating objects, among which mostly clothing and textiles of domestic use, like bed linens and aprons and all this kind of stuff. And this credit activity in Venice offered a way to the lower classes to convert this material wealth into cash or into basic commodities they need in their daily lives, like especially wine. Well, today wine has a different social role. Back in the day, it was like part of a very important part of the diet, of the everyday diet of people. So it has a completely different social role. Then in the paper, I also discuss about the interest rate, because when you mentioned the word predatory, a lot of like short-term small lenders today are on the, if not usurers, are on the border between legal and illegal, and interest rates are sometimes very high. Well, in this case, there is no interest rate, so the activity was interest-free. But we know that at least 1/3 of each transaction of each loan was supplied in wine. That means that if I went to a Bastione and I owned something that worth 9 lire, let's say, I would have received at least 3 lire in wine. And in the difference between the purchasing price of wine and the price of that they can apply to and they can ask for when they were selling it to the customers, that in this difference lied the what they earn on each transaction. I also tried to give an estimation, because we always usually like numbers, we usually like to see something that summarizes a broader discussion. So I basically compare the difference between purchasing and sale price, and I discovered that at a certain specific time around the mid of the 18th century, this was about 7% alone.
Well, and then they can, if I'm correct, right, there's also the default rates, right, that a reasonably high percentage of these loans defaulted, and then that was potentially another way for the Inns and Bastione to make money on the resale of that object.
Actually, that didn't happen. And because since the 14th century, there's a law that says, okay, if someone does not redeem their pledge, you can sell it to have back the money you invested in the transaction. But if when you sell it, you are able to sell it for a higher price than the one you paid for it, well, this surplus has to be given back to the borrower. This is a rule that we find in different kind of pawnbroking activities. Also, if you think about the Jewish moneylenders that are all around the Italian peninsula, and also in Venice, in the very famous ghetto, they have to follow the same rule. So they have to give back this surplus to the borrower. And it was also a way to protect, once again, the lower strata. This idea, let's say, the willing to protect the lower classes is almost everywhere in the sources.
And I mean, obviously, pawnbroking has been going on for some time in Venice, right? It's not, right, as you say, there's a long history of legislation. It's not being sort of invented in the 18th century, but is that what you see as shifting in this time, right? That we have a move towards regulation by the state, and then also this emphasis on protection of the lower classes, right? Does that sorry, you go ahead.
No, sorry. Well, these are very old activities. I couldn't really trace back when they started lending, but the first sources date back to the beginning of the 14th century, so quite an old period. What happened in the 18th century is that, also in line with the general bureaucratization of the Venetian society, we have a growing number of rules that are implemented, many of which are aimed at increase the control over the entire activity and protect the borrowers. So they wanted really to check every transactions. They want to have always growing information about each pledge, the value that was assigned to each pledge, etc. So yeah, there's this tendency of a growing bureaucratization, a growing control in the whole activity, and then which is also paralleled. I mean, it happened not by chance, but it's a moment in which the number of transactions seems to increase quite a lot. Because, well, I have data from public auctions. So we mentioned before that lenders had the right to resell the pledge that were not redeemed by the borrowers.
Right.
And that happened not by individually, but it was organized and controlled once again by the Giustizia Nuova. And the Giustizia Nuova organized almost daily public auctions that took place close to the Rialto Bridge, which was like the commercial heart of Venice. And every day, thousands of objects were sold through these public auctions. Well, I was able to collect a lot of data about that. And I know it's clear in the data, and there's a chart in the paper that shows that the number of objects sold through public auctions increased from 40,000 a year in the mid-18th century to about 120,000 a year in the 1790s. So it grows a lot. Well, then these are only unredeemed objects. So it's just, if you see it from the other perspective, we're talking about defaulted loans. So it's not the whole activity. I tried to estimate also and there's various ways, various systems I use to estimate this number of the total loans supplied by bastionieri and innkeepers. And so in that way also discover what was, or estimate what was the redemption rate. So how many loans were paid back by borrowers. And if we apply and if we trust my estimation, we know that the number of loans was about 120,000 in the 1740s. And so we have a redemption rate of 2/3 of the total.
Right.
And about 240,000 loans a year in the 1790s. So the redemption rate fell to just half of the loan. So it's also symptoms that something is changing in the overall pawnbroking activity.
Well, and that's sort of what I wanted to ask you next, right, is this question about overall changes and how the work that you're doing in this article fits into the larger project in your monograph, and how it makes us sort of rethink the economy of 18th century Venice.
Well, when I started this research, I wanted to study the Venetian credit market. I wanted to know how it worked. At the core of the research, there's of course this activity which we didn't know before, which gave us very interesting information about the lower classes, as we were saying before. But this is just a part of it. It's basically divided into three parts. I start from defining the activities that are at the center, like of the entire, or at least the first two parts. So what was a mean, what was a bastione, how was all this structure organized? Because, well, if we look at let's say we take a mean, if we look at it superficially, it seems that a mean is always the same in every city of Europe in the early modern period. But this is not actually true. There are a lot of small and big differences, and so we have to be quite careful. So this was my starting point. I said, okay, I want to first understand how these activities worked and who were those people involved from a supply side, let's say. And then the second part of the research moved to the credit activity of innkeepers and bastionieri, and it's more or less what it summarized in the paper. Of course, in the book it's way wider.
Right.
I indulge in several case studies which were quite interesting because they also they really show how things happen, and that's why the case studies are interesting. And of course, you can do that in a book. You cannot do that. You cannot talk too much, write too much in a paper. You have to be more strict. And the third part of the paper is probably the most interesting from a methodological point of view, because what I tried to do was to answer one simple question, which was not a simple answer, of course. So how did the pawnbroking activity of innkeepers and bastionieri fit in the overall credit market? So how was the Venetian credit market structured? So what I did in this case was to revise the entire literature existing basically on Venice in the 18th century on credit activities that concern Venice, add more quantitative sources which were missing for that period. For instance, I found a few ledgers of Jewish banks, Jewish banchi, as they are called in Italian, which were very interesting again to see how those banks worked. And they also allowed me to see the differences between the Jewish moneylenders and the innkeepers in their credit activity. And so, well, summing all the different parts, so making them all together and comparing them, I was able to understand a little bit better how the credit market in an early modern city worked. And basically what I saw is that it was a segmented market. So that means that there was just few competition. So I mean, the competition between the different lenders were really low, but they were addressing, targeting different parts of the demand for credit. So that's it, more or less.
Well, and to go back to the innkeepers that are the focus of this paper, right? You talk about, you use the idea of a currency of reputation in these exchanges, right? And these exchanges are happening on a neighborhood level, right, with people that you know, correct? Right? They're building upon existing social networks. Or can you just walk into a bastione of someone you didn't know in the city and get this kind of peer-to-peer loan?
Well, there are several things that need to be taken into consideration to answer that question. So the first one is that especially the inns were located exclusively in two areas of the city, which was the Rialto Bridge. So as I said before, the commercial part of the city, and then and St. Mark's Square, which was the administrative center of Venice. And they seem to be, or at least they say in their statutes, that they were addressed to foreigners and wealthy people.
Oh, okay.
While the bastioni were substantially different because they were spread all over the city. There was at least one bastione per each parish. Venice was divided into 70 parishes. So the idea we have is that well, they tend to know people in that area, because if you are like the center who sell wine, if you provide credit, if you're there, I mean, we expect that there was some kind of relationship between the bastioniere and the population in the parish. On the other hand, we have to consider that that was a pawnbroking activity. So in theory, even if you don't know a borrower, he or she is supposed to leave something collateral in exchange for a loan. So you're not running risks. Let's say there's no reputation play. It's just you're covered and everything happened. Then it's very difficult to trace who these persons, these borrowers were. I say that there's a part, the last part of the paper focuses on that. I found a list of names of borrowers that dates back to 1698, if I remember it right. It's a list of about 1,400 names, and there are only 25-ish, 23, if I remember correctly, borrowers that are listed as a man or a woman, and not by name, and in some cases surname, and usually the profession. So that suggests at least that borrowers and lenders knew each other. Then someone in the past, when I presented this paper, asked me, but so why, if they know each other, why they needed collaterals? Well, I don't know. I think that the system just evolved from something like it was pawnbroking since the beginning, and it continued to be pawnbroking since the end. And this is also part of what I define as the handkerchief economy, which is somehow midway between credit and barter. So, you could go to an inn or to a bastione and pay for your wine, just leaving an handkerchief or whatever you have at home.
You framed the beginning of the discussion in the paper around the 2008 financial crisis, right, and credit crises. I was wondering if I could get you to perhaps talk about sort of those connections and how they informed your approach to the topic, or sort of drew your interest in it, and also, if like our current financial moment has you making different reflections on sort of the systems of credits you're uncovering in 18th century Venice.
Well, I think that I was, like other historians and economic historians, working on financial markets and on credit, influenced somehow by the 2007 crisis, because it was something that really stuck to our mind, that conditioned also our way of looking at things. And when you do historical, that when you do historical research, you always start from the present. So you're always influenced by your own situation, and are always questioned from your times that goes back in time. But from the other perspective, what I usually say is that I am an historian, so I have the privilege of just looking at the past without needing to explain the present. So it's not easy to answer your question, and there are no traces of this activity or similar activities in Europe now, because when you at the beginning said that I study pre-bank credit markets, well, before and after the establishment of banks, the situation changed quite a lot. Pre-industrial Europe was embedded in social networks. We had credit that circulated between people without intermediation. Those kind of relations are way more difficult to find today, especially if we look outside of the family relationship. So I'm sorry, I cannot answer.
No. I think that's a great answer, right? And so, right, it's the emergence of credit banking in the 19th century, which leads to the decline of this. How does this practice fade away?
Well, there's a moment of transition between the two, of course, but now the credit market is basically absorbed and controlled by banks, which was not the case, of course, in 18th century Venice.
Right.
And that explains the variations I could study, the variety of lenders I could study in my book.
I know this is the Society for Italian Historical Studies, and the next project is Sweden, but can you talk about a little about that, and what you see as moments of connection between this work and where you're going now with the next project?
Well, with this project, I didn't just move north from Italy to Sweden, but it's also moved from one side to the other of the social ladder, because now I'm focusing on the wealthiest part of society, which is where studying inheritance and wealth accumulation is probably more interesting. Yeah, well, I don't see really. I think I just was interested to start looking at the other side, as I said, of the social ladder, and see how things happen among the rich. And there's a point in between this study, which also shifts a little bit from credit to wealth, because for a few years I worked on peer-to-peer credit transactions among like the middle to high strata in Sweden. So I moved, let's say, always move towards the higher, the richest part of society over time.
Well, I look forward to seeing how that sort of work develops and comes together. Thank you again for this article and this conversation. I hope we have a chance to meet in person sometime in the future.
Me too.
And I'd love to sort of continue talking about this. Yeah, thanks and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you very much.